Welcome to the Sleep Haunt. Tonight, we step into the dark with 9 true, disturbing, scary stories, tales that whisper from empty rooms, follow along silent roads, and linger in the corners where shadows wait. These aren't sudden frights, but echoes that stay long after the last word fades. Stay with me until the final story, for each thread pulls at the next, and the full shape of the night is only revealed at the end. If you enjoy nights like this, be sure to subscribe so you never miss what waits in the dark. And before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing where these stories travel. Story number 1. In a Midwestern city where winter makes concrete ring like glass, a temporary archivist named Mara took the second shift at the old founder's annex. It was the kind of building made when corners were meant to impress. Granite steps smoothed by a century of shoes, brass railings that remembered every fingerprint, and windows that held the cold even after sunrise. Her job was simple: on paper scan, catalog, and file. Yet the annex had a way of turning simple tasks into quiet rituals. The motion sensors clicked on in thin, measured sections as she moved, like a row of polite nods welcoming her back. On her first night, the security guard showed the basics. Badge the door. Sign the log. Don't let anyone in after 11. He tapped the log with his ring finger, a faint metallic note, and said not to worry if the elevator chimed once in an hour with no one on it. The building, he joked, had a memory. She smiled because buildings collect drafts and heat like stories, and it felt polite to agree. Somewhere in the rafters, an old vent hummed at a low pitch that made pens stir in their cups. There was a typewriter on display near the microfilm room, a heavy gray Remington behind glass with placards about clerks and efficiency. Its ribbon had dried decades ago. The plaque said it had typed more pages than any other machine, then retired with a jam that had bent an internal spring. People had once lined up at its desk with forms and fresh pencils. Now the desk held bouquets of paper clips in little magnetic clusters, diligent as a school of fish. Mara liked to glance at it on her way in, the way one might nod to a grandparent who had done enough work for 2 lifetimes. On the second week, near midnight, she heard a sound that didn't belong to her keyboard or the scanner's soft whir. It came measured, crisp, and distant. A single typewriter keystroke, followed by another, then a pause, as if whoever typed were thinking carefully. There were no typists in the building, and the Remington sat under glass, inert as a fossil. She paused with a manila folder in hand and listened. The sound arrived again: click, click, a long breath, then click. It was a sound with good posture, a polite sitting up of the air. The sensible explanation was a copied effect. Maybe a small pipe at the end of a cycle, 2 drops in a bucket with a plink she was dressing up as memory. Mara returned to the scanner, shifted a ledger into place, and let the software name it. The keys fell quiet. The ceiling lights hummed as if to fill the space. She held the moment firmly, the way one holds a glass that may be cracked, and put it down. On the way out at 2 in the morning, the elevator chimed once, uncalled. Its doors slid open to an empty car, and a draft brushed past her ankles like a cat too polite to be seen. A week later, she began to notice small corrections on the printouts. The database generated a thin slip for each batch: item number, shelf location, time. Twice, the slip included a line her software could not have added under location. A 12-digit code appeared. The extra digits led nowhere in the building's map. They felt like a gentle overreach, the way a houseplant may lean toward a window it did not know existed. Mara checked the logs, clicked through settings, even printed a test. Nothing in the system could have produced those numbers without her permission. She tore the slips off and taped them to her monitor, a minor puzzle that made the hours hum. On a windy Thursday, the printer spun to life without her. A single sheet slid out with clean edges and no header, as if shy about where it came from. The font was unmistakable typewriter letters with their slight wobble and the hollow O of a tired ribbon. The message was spare: Shelf C17 blue. Below that, in smaller letters, return by 2:13. She stood still a long moment, sensing the way a room changes when someone writes down a request. The clock over the door said 12:24. She considered tricks. Maybe the guard had a sense of humor, or a colleague wanted to initiate the new night hire with a breadcrumb trail, but the annex felt too old for pranks. It preferred dust to mischief. The basement map showed no blue. There were sea-level shelves, though, enough to hold a small century's worth of paper and cardboard and twine. C17 would be far back, under a duct that moaned in high winds. She took her badge and the small flashlight the guard had left for her, though the building's motion lights were generous with their attention. They rose as she went, puddles of white that preceded her steps down. The hallway smelled faintly of paper and old paste. Underneath, like a shadow of a smell, there was something cooler, as if the concrete had been recently washed with winter. The lower levels were organized in polite grids. The aisles named themselves in tasteful serif letters painted above eye level. She found C and counted her way. 11, 12, 13, like patience beads. At 17 she stopped. The shelf was ordinary gray steel, 3 tiers of boxes with taped labels in various tidy and chaotic hands. A strip of painter's tape had once been blue, and now faded to a shy green. Yet there, on the top shelf, a single box wore a fresh blue sticker. She felt a nudge of déjà vu, though she had never seen it. The sticker's shade matched the notion she had in her head when she read blue on the page. Inside the box were papers that felt both old and recently handled. Crisp edges, then a soft featheredness near the corners from years in air. The top sheet carried her name, and not a common misspelling either. Full, correct, precise. It was not a form, it was a list. Pending, scarf, card, key, cup. The list itemized a wool scarf she had looped around a chair, a badge clipped to her pocket, a tiny brass key that opened the microfilm drawer, a ceramic cup printed with an odd, modest constellation. Each item had a drawn square beside it, and each square contained an X. She had not returned anything, yet the paper considered the returns complete. She felt along the scarf draped over her chair back, and found it was not there. Her pocket held no badge. The microfilm drawer key was not in its dish. Her cup sat near the monitor, but it had been washed and dried and placed upside down as she would not have done, not mid-shift. She lifted it. The bottom was still cool with the memory of water. She looked at the clock. 12:38. She told herself she had moved the items and simply forgotten. There are brain spaces only night work occupies. It reshapes a person's reach in small, practical ways. The printer upstairs hissed again. When she returned, another sheet waited. The letters had that subtle wobble. Do not wait past 2:13. There was no signature. She set it beside the first, and felt the small, not unfriendly pressure of a schedule forming where there had not been one. The typewriter in the glass case stood quiet as ever, keys resting like small bones in a neat row. She tapped the glass without touching it, a greeting that did not claim more than it offered, and sat back down to work. When motion is all a building offers by way of conversation, the absence of it is suddenly lively. Around 1:10, the lights in the far corridor clicked on before she moved. They sometimes stuttered. That was their way. This time they rose in a line that curved toward the stairwell. She followed at a pace that said she hovered between caution and curiosity. The stairwell smelled like coin metal and felt heavier than the floor above, as if the lower levels had gathered extra night to wear like a shawl. The elevator dinged gently from somewhere below, then apologized for it by settling back to quiet. The city code, if one squinted at it long enough, allowed for a level called B3 on documents but not on buttons. It was a space of renovations and temporary rooms that had never learned how to be permanent. The stairs curved around what might have been an older shaft. At B2, the air cooled by a degree she could feel through her shirt. At the next landing, there was no sign, only a pale square on the wall where a sign had once been. The door was unmarked and old enough that the paint remembered fingers. She pushed. It gave as if it had been hoping for exactly that effort. B3, if that's what it was, had the tidy geometry of storage and the quiet charisma of the never-mentioned. Boxes labeled pending sat in walled aisles like a neighborhood designed by patience. Some were so old their labels looked like clouds. Some were recent enough to smell of marker ink. A small office with glass walls held a desk, a chair, a lamp with a shade the color of tea. The lamp was not on. On the desk rested a typewriter very like the one upstairs, only this one weighted without glass around it, ribbon in place, showing the self-possessed confidence of a tool that knows its job even when the person does not. There was a page in the carriage. When she stood in the doorway, the carriage lever twitched a precise millimeter, as if the machine were bracing its shoulders. Then, with the clean muscle of well-oiled parts in a room that had not known dust, one key pressed itself lightly. The type bar rose. 12:38. She told herself she had moved the items and simply forgotten. There are brain spaces only night work occupies. The city code, if one squinted at it long enough, allowed for a level called B3 on documents but not on buttons. It was a space of renovations and temporary rooms that had never learned how to be permanent. The stairs curved around what might have been an older shaft. At B2, the air cooled by a degree she could feel through her shirt. kissed the paper, and returned. The letter V appeared in a line that already contained words. She did not read them aloud. She did not move closer than necessary. The machine continued, with the steady patience of someone signing a long, careful name. The lamp clicked on by itself and off again, as if testing whether the room would argue. It did not. On the page, one sentence found its shape. Quiet is a place, not a noise. A second, smaller one followed, like an aside. Return by 2:13. The clock on the wall, an old round face with a neat hand, said 1:27. The machine stopped. The room felt like a held breath released. Mara stood still until the shape of the moment fit into the natural line of her night. She nodded, a small agreement that did not carry more weight than it could bear, and backed out to the aisle where her own box Saturday. She lifted it gently and found it too heavy for paper alone. Inside, beneath the list and a carbon copy of itself, lay duplicates of her belongings as they had been an hour earlier. The badge's clip had a faint hairline scratch she recognized. The scarf held the scent of the coffee shop she had passed at dusk. The cup bore a smudge on its rim in the place she'd wiped with her thumb 2 nights ago and missed by a fraction of an inch. She felt 2 cups in her life at once. The one upstairs, drying, and this one, as if the building had kept a draft when she handed in the finals. There was a note tucked into the scarf's fold. Nothing wants to be missing for long. The font had its dignified wobble again. The walk back to the main floor was ordinary and not. The motion lights behaved like hosts at an inn too old to advertise. Upstairs, the drying cup sat where it had been, no water ring beneath it. She checked her chair back, and the scarf was there, folded in a style she did not know. The microfilm key lay in its dish. The badge clipped at her pocket with a mute, exact click. The printer had powered itself down. The clock said 1:52. The elevator chimed once. She watched the doors open and close without judgment. The way a patient person watches rain to see whether it means to stay. For the remaining hour, nothing insisted. She scanned a ledger whose pages crackled like polite leaves. She labeled a folder with handwriting that pretended it had never rushed. At 2:11, the building breathed deeper, as if settling against its pillow of foundations. At 2:13, the second hand stepped over an invisible seam in the night. Something in the wall behind her softened, a muffled tiny thump like a book leaning back into place. The lamp over the typewriter downstairs, though she could not see it, had probably switched from on to off or off to on. Not everything requires witness to complete itself. Mara finished her shift, signed the log, and found the guard asleep at the desk with a crossword open to a stubborn clue. His pencil had left a comma of graphite on his thumb. She left a note that the basement lights might be on, and to check. He waved in his sleep at the sound of the door. A friendly wave turned by rest into something slower. The city breathed its winter into her scarf when she stepped outside. Buses whispered along the near-empty route, and windows held small bowls of light in tall buildings that dreamt in office hours. She did not quit. People in need of steady checks rarely do when the building learns their name. She returned, night after night, and the annex behaved as a place that had introduced its private rules and no longer needed to emphasize them. The typewriter printed things now and then with that dignified wobble. Take the stairs. Don't leave the lower door open. Replace the lid on coffee. Friendly. If one had the sort of mind that thinks instructions are a form of care, twice the printer insisted on a time. 2:13. She began to regard 2:13 the way a person regards a crosswalk light. Not a law, exactly, but a steady and polite request worth honoring. Months passed. An early spring made the stairwell smell faintly of cool stone and distant rain. The annex swallowed the warmth gladly, old bones doing their best. Her contract was ending when she found, slipped under the office door, a thick inner-office envelope bearing the annex's return address in a font that had left service before she was born. Inside was a carbon copy of a pending inventory, dated the week she started, with her name typed twice, once with a stray letter that had been X'd out neatly by someone careful enough to use the top of the X. At the bottom it said, "Last return accepted 2:13 a.m. It listed the items she remembered returning and a final line. Occupant remains. Some phrases move in slow circles. She brought the envelope home and left it on the table like a bowl of water set out for an animal that may or may not visit. The city warmed into a season where the sidewalks sounded less like glass. She took a daytime job, not in a library, not with records, but somewhere with windows. The guard called once to say a couple of envelopes had arrived with her name, then called back to say they had disappeared from his desk. He laughed the way someone laughs at static on an old radio. He retired not long after, his ring finger still leaving a small, clear tap on the logbook until his last week. A year later, an envelope forwarded through 3 different departments arrived without comment. The stamp was smeared into a small weather. It held a single page, typed in that familiar posture, nothing missing for long. Underneath, in smaller letters, quiet is a place, no request, no time. She understood it as the annex's version of a farewell, that even departures were filed, that endings too had their proper shelves. The corner of the page bore the impression of a paperclip long gone, the ghost shape of a practical thing. She slid the paper into a drawer that held receipts, keys, a postcard no one had claimed. At night, sometimes, the neighbor's dishwasher made a clicking sound, steady and polite, like a single key at a time working its way across a carriage. People told stories about the annex after. A city blog published a piece about predictive records, about the old planning department's machine that could pre-type the right names for budgets, about ghost maintenance tickets that fixed a leak before it began. The building made no comment. The new guard, younger and fond of earbuds, kept a neat log and did the crossword digitally. The plaque by the glass-case typewriter collected dust again and didn't complain. If a printer woke up on its own, it did so at respectable hours. As for Mara, when time ticked past 2:13, she sometimes felt the soft completedness of a shelf accepting a weight it had prepared for. Not dread, and not relief either. A punctuation that knew when to stop. Quiet remained a place, not a noise. She had visited it. It had made a ledger entry for exactly that, and she fulfilled it by moving on. In a city where winter proves itself and spring arrives as a suggestion, an old building kept its habits, and a woman kept her promise to return her things on time. The rest filed itself with the care that makes rooms easier to enter again, even if no one does. Story number 2. On a state route that ran like a string through pine and wheat fields, a night driver named Ellis kept a schedule that most clocks would consider patient. The company called it Route 19, though regulars preferred its landmarks. The silo with the faded advertisement, the truck stop with pie at 3 in the morning, the narrow bridge that sang under tires. His coach was clean, the kind of clean that came from a person who makes small habits and never breaks them. He wiped the dash with a humble pride and listened for the soft telltale rattle that meant a coin had slipped loose inside the fare box. 4 nights a week he watched the world through glass and mirror, following a map that did not surprise him. The route had a place that made him slow without thinking. Between a service road and a slope where pines stood with the quiet of old men, a new mile marker had been installed. Bright as a button. Mile 77. The reflective paint was so fresh it looked wet, the edges of the post so crisp it seemed it had been planted not by a crew but by the road itself. On his first pass after it appeared, Ellis gave it the kind of nod a driver gives to a change that does not require an opinion. He felt the faintest tug, a muscle memory that had not existed until that moment, as if an extra gear had been set under his foot. Most nights, the radio on his dash hummed with the patient decorum of dispatch. Crews called in road debris at exit ramps, or late passengers waving from empty corners. The voice at the center of the network was even and unflustered, the way a library keeps its voice low so everyone can find what they need. That week, the voice changed in a way only someone who listened for a living would notice. Dispatch began to offer arrival times before he asked, a half beat early, a hair ahead of schedule, as if the radio were already inside the next minute and was coming back to meet him. It wasn't wrong. It just knew slightly too much. On Tuesday, the air held a rain that couldn't commit. The coach's wipers moved with gentle authority, clearing what might have been mist and might have been indecision. Ellis turned down his aisle light to let the outside have more of the glass. At mile 77, the new sign caught his headlights and sent them back like a polite bow. There was someone by the post. She stood as if waiting not for him but for something that would arrive anyway. Red raincoat closed at the throat, hands inside sleeves. This stretch had no sanctioned stop. Still, he eased the bus to the shoulder in a way that felt like a person pushing in their chair out of respect. When the doors hissed open, the scent of pine and wet dust folded in. The woman did not step forward. "Is this the last run?" she asked, without stepping closer. Her voice had the not-quite echo of someone speaking from the other side of a garage close, but with a spare bit of space. "No," Ellis said, glancing at the dash clock more out of habit than need. "Third to last." She nodded as if he had confirmed a suspicion that had nothing to do with buses. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Only then did she step back, not toward the trees, not toward the field, but a precise half-step, as if to return herself to an exact dot on the ground. He closed the doors. In the mirror, the red of her coat hung in the wet air like a thought that had not decided whether to stay or go. By the coin laundry 3 towns over, he had mostly folded the encounter into the night's inventory. A person who had her own reasons, and a driver who respected them. The laundry sign blinked laundry in steady white and a soft neon underline. It had been there as long as he had, he liked to think. Tonight the underline buzzed, then steadied. Exact change only. The taped paper by the change machine reminded everyone gently. He had exact change for everything when he drove. It made the small machines go smoothly. Fares, coffee, the 2-burner stove that the diner called a grill. He wrote mile 77 inches his log when the coach was empty, and the parking lot hum bled into quiet. It was a habit he did not question. There was no reason to show the note to anyone. He wasn't even sure he'd written it to remember so much as to watch his hand make sense of the night. Wednesday, the air cleared and held stars that had nothing to prove. Ellis's coach took the curves with the familiarity of a comfortable chair standing up to greet him. The radio offered its small predictions again. 2 minutes early entering Kindle Street, dispatch said in that even tone, before he turned onto the feeder. Hold for the clock if you need. He smiled, because drivers and dispatchers live on that sort of courtesy. At mile 77, the red coat stood where it had yesterday. The angle of the woman's shoulders said she had not been surprised by the timing. He slowed again without instructing his hands to do so. The doors opened, bringing in night and a hint of damp wood. "Last run?" she asked. "Second to last," he said. "Almost," she said, not to him exactly. He thought he saw the reflection of the bus lettering on her coat, the route number bending across the slick fabric as if trying to read itself. She stepped back to the same small patch of earth. He closed the doors, eased the bus back into the road, and saw in the mirror that the new milepost glowed as if recently washed. With certain stretches of route, a repetition can move from comfort to careful. Thursday became that. The woman was there again. The coat was the same red, but not lazily the same. It had the persistent texture of something being chosen exactly. The question was the same. Last run? There was no impatience in it, only a clock. Checking courtesy a person uses when asking the time in a waiting room. "Last," he said. She lifted her chin a fraction, as if tasting rain. "Thank you," she said. And this time, she stepped up. Her hand did not fumble with the fare box. She did not look at the chart. She slid a coin into the slot with the confidence of someone returning a borrowed thing. The coin chimed, a true tone that made the coach's quiet seem suddenly structured. When she sat, she did not take a window. She chose the third seat on the right, just past the rear door, the place teenagers favor when they want to talk quietly. Her posture had none of a teenager's angles. She sat the way someone does who is giving their back a favor. Ellis did not ask where she was going. Most people, given silence, will tell. They will tell in the way they check the window, the quick lift of the eyes in the place where they know they will want to stand, the way their knees tense as a familiar parking lot comes into view. She did not look out. She watched the aisle in a manner that honored the bus's geometry. He drove. The radio did not interrupt. At the coin laundry, the sign blinked. The underline flickered in a sequence that recognized itself, then steadied. 2 stops after the laundromat. Before the thrift store with the clock that always read 10 after 9, the woman pulled the cord. The bell made its gentle tap. Ellis eased to the curb in a fluid line that a person learns after years of not jolting sleeping riders awake. He opened the doors and half stood, partly because manners do that to a person, partly because the stop was not a stop. Where her feet met the ground, there was no sign, no bench, no shelter. The curb looked new, though. The sidewalk panel there was cleaner than the rest. as if replaced recently or rinsed with care. She stood on the fresh square and looked at her hands as if counting them. "Thank you," she said. He was about to ask if she was sure, but the question felt like a pebble tossed into a pool that did not belong to him. He nodded instead. She stepped out. The doors closed with their gentle swallow. As the bus pulled away, he looked in the mirror. For a moment that might have been a trick of glass. He saw a version of his own coach pulled against the opposite curb, door open, a driver with his posture looking over a shoulder. Then the road took the mirror, and the reflection was an ordinary dark sedan, parked where the curb made a small suggestion. The coin box chimed softly then, a small echo without a hand. He paid attention to the simplicity of his lane and the discipline of his stops. When the coach was empty again, on the far end of the route, he opened the coin box with the practiced twist and tilt and read the day's currency like a fortune that only offered ounces and metal. On top sat the coin she had dropped. It was an ordinary quarter, except it was not ordinary. Its year was the year the route had been established, long before he'd taken the wheel. Its edges were smooth, worn away by machine and pocket. But under the wear, there was something that felt like care. He set it on the ledge by his log and watched how it did not roll or slide, but rested with precise intent as the engine idled. After long work, little details have the way of standing up straighter. Friday. The seat-reserved placard, that usually rattled quarter sweet at the curve near the reservoir, did not rattle. It remained steady, as if someone had tightened it in the hour between loops and forgotten to mention the favor. A street light near Kindle blinked off when he blinked, then on when he did not. Dispatch remarked on none of it. It offered its predictions, then fell silent in the spaces where regulars stumbled aboard with grocery bags balanced carefully against their coats. Mile 77 contained its own weather. On Friday, it exhaled a cool breath from the pine, the sort of air that would make a person wake up and check the window at home without knowing why. The red coat was there. The posture was exactly the same, but the light made it a new moment. "Last run?" she asked. "It is," he said, and listened to his own voice, wondering whether it sounded like a person describing a circle. She boarded, dropped her coin with that unassuming decisiveness, and took the same seat. He drove. She pulled the cord at the same new curb. When she stepped down, he saw a flicker of himself again, across and behind him, as if a mirror had been propped against the opposite sidewalk, and caught him in the act of looking. This time, he lifted his hand without thinking. The not him lifted his hand as well. Whether they had waved at each other or at the road, neither could say. In the morning, the company's clocking station accepted his card as it always did, and printed a line that made a number of sense. Out 412. He could have let it be. He did not. He asked for the previous night's sheets with a calm voice and a cup of coffee to suggest he was not in any hurry. The figures read clean, yet between 053 and 116, there was a crossed out line, then the same line typed neatly beside it, listing an unscheduled stop near a street that did not yet appear on the map. The note field read, in someone else's careful hand, "Curb poured last month." He ran his thumb along the edge of the paper and felt the indentation of a pen stroke that was not his and could not be. The weekend went by with daytime light and errands. The bus garage hummed without him. He might have decided the week had been a handful of meaningful coincidences, and a mind too willing to join dots. Monday returned with its practical face. He took his seat at 2157, checked mirrors he knew, and pulled his coach into a familiar line of light and shadow. The road answered. Mile 77 had a visitor again, though this time it was not the red coat. A man in a gray jacket stood there with the sort of attention a person gives a small plaque, as if reading something he already knew but needed to see in print. He lifted his hand in a way that asked for a ride and for permission in the same gesture. Ellis slowed. The doors opened. The man stepped to the threshold but did not cross it. "Have you seen a woman in a red coat?" he asked, and the question sat in the air in a way that showed he was rehearsing not the words but the answer. "Yes," Ellis said, and heard the weight that one syllable carried. "She said there would be a last run," the man said, softer. He looked down at his hand as if checking that he had brought it. "She said she'd be on it." "She was," Ellis said. The man's shoulders loosened, not in relief, not in collapse, but in the manner of a coat being returned to a hook. "Thank you." he said, and moved back a precise half-step to the same patch of ground the redcoat had favored. He didn't turn away. He watched the side of the bus as if the letters might shift and show him something in their shuffling. Ellis closed the doors and moved on, the bus finding its line again with the focus of a practiced hand on a pencil. That night and the next two, the redcoat returned. The question, the coin, the seat, unchanged. Each time she disembarked at the new square of sidewalk that had quietly joined the town. Each time, for just a breath, the mirror made an argument for another bus, another driver, a parallel precision. And each time, the feeling that he was following a set of small rules written somewhere just to his left grew, not in insistence, but in clarity. He decided on a kindness. On Thursday, before his first loop, he stopped at the supply closet, took a small square of reflective tape the way drivers do when a taillight needs temporary etiquette, and cut a thin line from it. At mile 77, when the road was quiet and the sunrise was a rumor hours away, he pulled to the shoulder, killed his headlamps, and stepped out with the tape in his hand. The air smelled of cold sap and a distant skunk having second thoughts. He pressed the strip to the back of the mile post at a height even with his shoulder. It was not a note anyone else would see in the glare of day. It was a private marker he could recognize in the soft bounce of his own lights. He returned to his seat, folded back into the route, and felt for a moment less like he was being told, and more like he was being permitted. When the redcoat appeared that night, he did not change anything. He answered. He drove. She disembarked at the new curb. After the doors closed, the radio clicked on, with no preamble. Dispatch's voice spoke in the same careful tone it used for weather advisories. "Hold service 6 minutes at Lemon and Ash," it said. "The signal is being reset." Lemon and Ash was the corner with the thrift store and the clock that read 10 after 9. He held. The bus idled in a pool of soft streetlight. The thrift store's window showed a row of porcelain cats that did not blink. When 6 minutes had passed, the radio clicked again. "Thank you," Dispatch said and went quiet. At the end of that loop, the coin box offered a new small sound. He opened it and found the quarter from the first redcoat night had shifted from the place he had set it. It now nested inside a circle imprinted on the plastic tray, as if someone had traced it absent-mindedly and then set the coin inside the silhouette. The ring had not been there before. He pressed his thumb over it and felt the slight, precise groove of something designed. A few nights later, a storm put a shine on everything that did not ask for it. Wipers worked like steady small arms, and the bus's lights carved the rain into useful shapes. At mile 77, the reflective tape on the back of the post returned his own beam with a shy flash, a secret handshake. There was no one at the post. He felt, unexpectedly, a twinge that might have been disappointment, and might have been respect for a cycle concluding itself properly. He drove on. The stop by the new sidewalk square felt even newer. Street crews had left sand in narrow lines along the curb. Cones waited farther down, huddled like monks, deciding whether they were needed. He would have passed without thought, but the bus itself made a tiny pause. He did not touch the brake. The coach simply acknowledged an idea of stopping. He accepted the suggestion, brought the bus to a neat idle, and opened the doors on air and rain. From the mirror, from the night, from the angle one uses when a hallway meets a room, another bus coasted into view. It was his bus, and it was not. Because all coaches of a certain age carry the same bones. In its window, a driver lifted his hand. Ellis lifted his. Their timing was off by a fraction. The other hand remained up a split second longer, and in that not-quite match he felt a softness like the moment two singers take a breath at almost the same time. At the end of his shift, he parked as always, set the brake with the small satisfaction of a job completed, and filled out the log with the quiet accuracy of a person who honors paper. He slid the old quarter into the thin pocket of his wallet, next to a photograph that had been there so long its corners had committed to their curve. He did not carry the coin for luck. He carried it because sometimes a small weight reminds the hand that it belongs inside a world that keeps track. For a while after, the milepost became something like a landmark within a landmark, a way he knew not just where he was, but when. Tourists rarely rode at that hour, but on the nights one did a young man with a camera strap around his neck, An older woman with a map folded into a polite square. They too glanced at mile 77 with a look he recognized. That feeling when a piece of the world seems to glow just a little from holding still. Later, a maintenance crew replaced the road from lemon to ash with a smoother run that made coffee cups smile in their holders. A crosswalk appeared by the fresh curb, then a shelter with glass that forgave fingerprints easily. Atlas riders lengthened a street there by 1 block and gave it a name that sounded as if it had always existed. Someone would stand under the shelter on rainy afternoons, holding a red umbrella, not a coat, and watch buses pass by with a small trust that the inside of a vehicle is warmer than the outside of a day. Once, months after the last sighting, Ellis took a daytime fill-in on a Sunday when the schedule needed a favor. Children climbed stairs with teacup chatter. Sun found every piece of glass and auditioned it for a sparkle. At mile 77, the post looked older, as if it had accepted its job. By the base of it lay a coin, half pressed into the soft edge of the dirt where mowers don't always go. He stopped after his loop, walked back with the easy stride of a person on their lunch, and bent to lift it. It was not the quarter from his box. It was a dime, its year newer by decades, but it had the same patient wear. He set it on his thumb and tossed it gently, just once. It spun and stilled. He did not pocket it. Instead, he pressed it into that thin groove of reflective tape, where it adhered for a moment like a polite eye. When he returned that night for his regular shift, the dime was gone, and a dark, round smudge marked where it had been, as if a small planet had passed in front of a quiet star. Drivers talk in codes that are not meant to be secrets, yet are. Someone would mention a light that now changed a beat sooner than it used to, and someone else would say, "Since spring?" and nod as if a question had been answered. A mechanic would tighten a bracket that had not, by rights, loosened, and remark that it always loosens after rain. A dispatcher would leave a note on a clipboard. Hold at lemon, divided by ash for 3, a habit that would outlive the person who wrote it. If anyone asked about mile 77, the answers were practical. There was a hill there that made fog behave oddly. The shoulder cut away faster than it looked, and it was wise to give it room. The pine dropped cones like marbles in November. The road learned to expect them. When Ellis retired, his wallet held that quarter with the route's birth year, slippery with the oil of 1,000 thumb checks. He took the long ways home like drivers do when they no longer have to make time. Sometimes he parked by the old laundromat, now a cafe with plants that enjoyed the window as much as the customers did, and watched buses lean into the corner like large polite animals. Once, waiting at the light by the new shelter, he saw a woman step out, red umbrella lowered. She paused at the curb and looked at her hands as if counting them. It was not the coat, and it was not the same person, but the motion was exact, the sort of muscle memory an ordinary corner might adopt from a story. He did not say anything. He did not write the company. He had donated his pens to a thrift store in a box labeled office. But for a long while, through different seasons and changing mugs of coffee, he kept the habit of driving on the never-quite night of memory. In those drives, the radio would sometimes click on without a voice, complete silence, a way of indicating presence. He would wait 6 minutes at a corner in his mind. He would bless a curb that had once needed a name. He would pass mile 77 and nod again to a post that had the good manners to never feel lonely. The route continued after him, as routes do, as steady as the rhyme in a lullaby that never quite sleeps. New drivers took the wheel and learned the good places to coast and the poor places to turn. Once in a while, one of them would leave a note on the bulletin board without signing it. It would say something like, "Someone stands by 77 sometimes, opens their hand, asks about last runs. They're polite. If you stop, they'll know what to do." And below it, in a different hand, someone would have written, "Exact change only. Not a rule. Just a comfort." Story number 3. A late summer drought drew the reservoir down until its banks showed their ribs. The water took on a deep, steady sound, as if the lake had practiced how to speak quietly to stone. A temporary cartographer named Lena took a contract to help the Watershed Authority digitize old contour sheets in a single-room cabin above the spillway. The cabin was practical. A work table with a glass top and a light under it. A flatbed scanner that thrummed like a cat. A metal cabinet with drawers that whispered when opened. The windows looked down on the water and up at a shoulder of dry pine. In the rafters hung a string of faded survey flags, their orange now a patient peach. Each morning she unrolled a map with a reverence that felt half professional, half superstitious. The sheets were thick and smelled faintly of cotton and pencil. They showed the lake's floor in cream and pale green with brown lines marching around like careful steps. When she scanned them, the screen lit with contours that climbed cleanly through 30, 40, 50 feet, until the numbers became a language the dam knew in its bones. She saved each file, named it, and pulled another map. Outside, dragonflies made nervous cursive in the heat. On the fourth morning, an extra pencil line sat on the map she'd rolled up the night before. The line did not match the old hand. It floated above the last measured elevation like a held breath. It looped around a cove and tucked into itself on the north bank near a stand of cottonwood. In a clear, small hand beside it, someone had written, "Mirror calm, 5:41. She checked her phone. At 5:41 she had been asleep on the cabin cot with its thin quilt and a view of the window latch silhouetted against pale light. She had not touched a pencil after 11. The only other key belonged to the dam operator, who had gone home before dusk. Nodding toward the forecast that promised exactly nothing, Lena thought of practical jokes and neighbors who liked to walk early with a dog that didn't bark. She felt along the paper with 2 fingers and found the drag a fresh line makes, hardly raised but present to skin. She scanned the sheet and printed a copy of the line. At lunch, she took the path that wound to the north bank. The cottonwoods stood in a shy half-circle. Bits of green water pressed against the shore, with a sigh that sounded rehearsed. A shallow, smooth patch of the lake held itself without a wrinkle. A dragonfly hovered and pivoted in a tiny axe of light. The next morning, another line. "Wake of 2, the margin said, at 6:03. She was awake then, not by intention but because a moth had found the light and sampled the glass of the window in 3 precise taps. She watched the lake and saw nothing that would have made a wake. Still, she believed whoever had written it had seen exactly what they claimed. The handwriting was tidy, in a way that did not show off. It had the gravity of someone who knows that notes become facts when others use them. She left a cheap mechanical pencil on the map at midnight, point toward the south. In the morning, the pencil had turned half a degree, its eraser a shy crescent. A line curved toward the dam face, dipping just below the 28-foot contour before returning. "Chime at 2:14, it said, and this she could confirm. The metal ladder on the spillway had rung once in the still hour with a tone that didn't carry far or insist, only announced itself and dissolved. It became a kind of correspondence. She marked her own notes in a different color on copies, careful not to touch the original except to lift and lower it. The unknown hand drew what the night saw, and wrote what it heard. "Owls trading," one margin said. "Wind at knee. 3 bats at beam." The lines were precise, not imaginative. They moved where the land would let feet move. Behind shale, along cow paths that remembered cattle long gone, through a gate whose hinge sighed like a small tired accordion. When she walked the drawn paths in daylight, she found shoe prints that were not large or small enough to tell her anything, just distinct enough that she could call them prints and not shapes. A camera seemed an obvious answer. She pointed it at the table and left it rolling. By morning, the file played back a long gray quiet. At 3 intervals, the lens fogged for less than a second, as if a cool breath had met a warm surface and decided to be polite about it. The pencil never moved in frame. The lines appeared between one clarity and the next without acting out their own arrival. She called the dam operator, a man named Aviv, who wore a brimmed hat and kept a folded newspaper in his truck for reasons he could not explain. He listened, without teasing. "Maps like to be updated," he said, and the way he said it turned a sentence into a small shrug with company. "If the lake wants to narrate, you could do worse than be the pen." He told her he would be doing a brief training release on Thursday at 11, hardly more than a change in breathing. "You'll hear a pause before the water licks the new stones," he said. "It always pauses. No one believes me until they're standing there." The night before the release, the added line did something it hadn't. It left the lake and climbed the embankment toward the concrete platform where visitors stood on field trips. It marked a small cross on the far corner, the spot that caught an angle of sound and turned it into something like a room. "Wait here 11:03 for quiet," the margin said. It used the same hand, calm and useful. She went at 10:59, not because she needed proof, but because part of working alone is acknowledging favors. Aviv stood with his hat in his hands. 2 minutes, he said, and checked the face of a round analog that read as if it had never been wrong. The spill gates shifted in a steady exhale. Water shouldered itself along the lip, and then, at 11:03, paused. The pause was not long. It was long enough to move into. A hush tucked itself around the platform. It made her skin feel aligned with the day. Then the foam gathered and marched, and sound resumed its sentence. Aviv looked at his hat and grinned like a boy, learning a trick with a coin. After that, the lines became more personal, though not in a way that asked for anything. "Lock the screen," one said, and she realized she'd left the porch door barely latched. "Bring extra water to North Path," said another, and there had been no shade. "Keep the left boot," one margin advised. And she understood only when a seam gave on the right after a day of heat. A storm diverged around the valley midweek, leaving a torn hem of cloud and a brief, impatient shower. The map noted it later with a dashed loop. "Mud wants to slide here," it wrote, and a finger-length arc curved below the 7th contour. On her way out that evening, she saw the small slump of earth precisely where the line suggested and stepped around it without learning anything the hard way. A night arrived that kept the cabin awake. The breeze turned from lake to hill and back again. The porch light hiccuped once and settled. The added path on the map traced a route from the table to the door, down the steps, across the rough lawn, along the fence line where sage held the ground in a patient grip, and toward the riprap by the dam's edge. Tiny notes appeared along the way, as if a careful walker were reminding themselves how to keep time. "Count to 4 between lamp and latch. Step wide at depression. Wait at rock, the shape of a shoulder." The last note at the waterside said only, "Be at ease." She did not follow it outside. She copied the line onto a thin acetate and laid the overlay on the floor, aligning the table corner with the cabin's corner, the door drawn over the door's shadow. Then she walked the path inside to its imitation, counting between objects as the note suggested. When she paused, wind brushed the cabin from the same direction the overlay indicated. When she took 3 steps to the far wall, the spillway ladder rang, delicately, once. The porch light dipped and returned. She stopped at the kitchen counter, opposite the overlay's rock the shape of a shoulder, and felt the house accept a weight that had not been hers until she shared it. The next morning, the lake had risen by less than an inch. A line hugged the new margin, with a tenderness maps can sometimes show to real things. "There," the margin said, and it wasn't clear whether the word belonged to the water finding itself, to the pencil that had told it, or to the person who had chosen to believe a little in both. Her contract ended with the month. She cleaned the glass, returned the scanner with a receipt that felt heavier than paper, and locked the cabinet with a key that dated to a year when the lake had first learned to be held. She left a sharp new pencil on the table and a blank sheet beneath a folded note. "Thank you. Keep the lines honest." It was not addressed to anyone. It did not need to be. In the city, her apartment lived above a shop that sold plants with names that liked Latin. At night, a fan made a sound like someone writing carefully. Once, months after the cabin, a tube arrived with no sender listed, only her name in a tidy, modest hand that did not fuss. Inside was a reduced copy of the reservoir map, contours tight as the rings of a tree. A single thin line added itself around the shape like a quiet arm. In the margin, in pencil, it said, "Contour is a promise. We return where we started." The paper smelled faintly of cotton and water, and the graphite of a note made after midnight. On a winter walk, a city pond wore its own map under ice, ridges of frozen wind, bubbles that froze into commas, a white crust where skaters took an honest turn and corrected. She stood at the rail, counted to 4 between her breath and the streetlight changing color, and listened for a hush that did not belong to her street at all. Somewhere near the base of that old dam, a ladder probably struck itself once and fell quiet. If a line traced itself on paper in a small room, it did so without asking to be believed. It made a shape of careful steps in the dark, and a soft, definite instruction written in a patient hand. Be at ease. Story number 4. In a neighborhood where storefronts closed early and the streetlights wore haloed hats, the Alba Playhouse kept a single bulb burning after hours. The standing lamp sat mid-stage, an old metal base with a fresh cord, and a globe that glowed the patient color of tea. Everyone called it the ghost light because everyone did, not because anyone needed a story. The bulb kept ankles safe from the orchestra pit and made the stage feel less like a quiet lake and more like a lit room. A stage manager named Rowan took the overnight shop hours for a week, while a roof leak forced rehearsals to end early. The theater paid time and a half for late repairs, and the dim light of an empty house suited someone who liked lists. The set was a city street in miniature. Brick flats painted on tall drops, a stoop, a lamppost with a secret switch, a door that opened into a hallway that led nowhere. Tape on the deck marked actors' paths in faded neon. The air held a mix of sawdust and rosin and the clean metal scent of cable. Rowan checked the board, flicked through cue stacks on the console, and tested headsets. She spoke into the dark to confirm the line. "Com check." Silence answered in that fine-grained way that includes every small noise, the soft hum of dimmers, the shell, sound of a big room at rest. She did not mind being the only voice. A stage is built to hold voices without judgment. On the second night, the headset hissed with a brief, gentle presence. Not a voice yet, only a thread of static that knew the shape of words. Then, as if it had practiced breath, a calm tone spoke, house to half. She watched the indicators without touching them. They slid down to half, as if obeying an invisible hand. The audience seats shifted from dark to the warm hush that makes whispered programs easier to read. "Stand by," the voice said. "Places." It used the show's cadence, the way stage managers inherit timing from each other like recipes. Rowan looked at the clock on her phone. It read 10:23. There was no rehearsal scheduled. She could have cut power. Instead, she kept still. The call board held its pinned notes. Safety reminders, prop lists, the day's scene work scrawled with exclamation marks beside a joke in a neat hand. "Do not move the ghost light unless you want company." The bulb hummed, steady and gentle. "Stand by LX 1 through 5. Stand by sound QA," the headset voice said. "Standing," Rowan said, "because muscle memory is a kind of good manners." She rested her finger near the go button without touching. The voice took no offense from the silence. After a breath long enough to feel like a thought, it said, "Go." The console chased through a sequence she hadn't engaged. Light cues slipping into each other with the soft flourish of a curtain hem. The lamppost glowed. The painted flats looked almost like buildings. House lights dimmed to black. Something like footsteps crossed the deck. Not heavy, not far. Just the small pressure of boards considering new weight. The stoop's handrail held the ghost of a touch. It remembered every coat ever slid along it. A single cough came from the second row, center. It had the casual honesty of someone clearing their throat in a room where a throat has a right to be cleared. Rowan watched the stage without trying to invent faces. The headset made a room of her head. The voice called cues, not hurried, not slow. A door on the set swung open and shut, with the expectation of a line that did not arrive. Far upstage, a fan turned once. The lamppost dimmed by a hair and returned, a nervous breath in metal. At 10:37 the voice said, "Hold," and everything obeyed. The silence that followed felt like a hallway with a door at either end. Then the sequence unwound itself. House lights crept to half, then full. The headset settled into its sleeping crackle. The clock on her phone read 10:41. She wrote the numbers down on the back of a light plot printout, not to prove anything later, just to fold the moments into a line. The next night, it resumed. The time came earlier, as if it were returning to when it was meant to be. 10:16. Calls in the same unhurried tone. "Stand by. Go." A soft door. A hush. The cue sheet on the console's screen showed a stack she didn't remember building. "Night Walk," the header read, in a font the console didn't use. It listed numbers that skipped and then caught themselves, like steps taken with care in the dark. The final cue had a title, "End of Run." She asked the custodian, a person who knew every stair squeak by name, if she had noticed the console lighting itself. The custodian smiled, but did not tease. "The building likes rhythm," she said. "If you keep to it, it keeps to you." Then, the practical part. "Please sign the ladder out. The top tread is tagged. The roofers fixed the worst, but the seam over stage left's catwalk needs a second look." Rowan placed gaff tape on the fourth step, a bright stripe to remind the body not to climb into a guess. She liked the reminder. She liked the way rules look when written in tape. Temporary, sensible, adopted by agreement. On the third night, a program sat on seat E13, folded in half with the neatness of a hand that knows how to fold paper so it stays folded. The cover showed the season's titles. The advertised show had opened last month. This set was for the play that would come next. No one ever sat in that one seat during rehearsals. It had a mild draft above it from an old vent, and actors avoided it out of habit. Rowan took the program to the call desk and left it under the gooseneck light, face down. At 10:09, the headset voice arrived. House to half. It came with something new, the soft rustle of paper, as if someone in the second row were opening a program they had not seen before. The voice added, almost lightly, "Thank you, House." The sequences moved like a hand, returning an item to a familiar shelf. When the lamppost came up this time, a moth brushed past the lens of its glass and decided against it. A pair of unseen feet paused at the tape mark downstage center, the small pad of shoe rubber agreeing with paint. Rowan spoke into comms not to disrupt, but to meet it halfway. Standing likes 1 through 5, SNED A. When the voice said go, she went with it. The cues felt true. The lights curved into each other without showing their edges. The set revealed itself as if it had been born there, rather than wheeled in and bolted. In the empty house, a single clap sounded one. Not many then stopped, as if the person had realized they were early and folded their hands. The fourth night it began at 10:02. Rowan had learned the language by then. Stand by. Go on the breath. Wait for the small hold at 10:14 when the lamppost leaned into the dark. She set the ghost light precisely at center, the power cable arcing in a gentle S that did not trip anyone at all. She opened the trap lid just an inch to check the lock, then closed it and laid a bright ribbon of tape across it, with a label in neat block letters. "Closed, please." The building seemed to relax. The boards did not creak where they might have. Past the midpoint of the sequence, the headset offered a word it had not used. Final. Final 2, the voice said, and the lamppost lowered a fraction. Final door, and the upstage hallway held a deeper, dark, respectful, not abrupt. The stage picture looked like a street at the end of the block, where a person turns around to see their own house with a softness they had not afforded it while walking away. On the fifth night, before the sequence started, someone or something with respect for thumbtacks had added a slip to the callboard. The paper stock matched the theater's office supply. The font did not. It read, "Please prepare courtesy hold for applause." Rowan had never met the person who wrote it. She put her finger on the word courtesy. It felt impossible to argue with. The clock read 9:56 when the voice returned. House to half. Stand by. Go. Her own standing began to knit inside the pattern like a thread that had belonged there all along. At the end of the series, instead of letting the house rise immediately, she waited a measured beat, the way one waits for a last word at a dinner table. One clap, then one more. A pause, the size of a smile. She brought the house to half. The sound did not try to be more than it was. After, she walked down to the edge of the stage and looked at the house as if it were someone's face. Seat E13 held its folded program again. She left it. In the morning it was gone, and on the console someone had labeled a spare playback button with a piece of tape and a pen. Walkout. The storm repairs ended on schedule. The calendar said rehearsal would return to afternoons, tech to evenings, and there would no longer be sanctioned overnight hours. On the last, late shift, the headset voice began at 9:48. The timing had come home. The lamppost knew when to lean. The door knew when to rest open. Just that small. The final cues sat in the stack like polished stones. Rowan placed the ghost light mid-stage and coiled the cable with care so the loops lay flat. She checked the tape on the trap and smoothed a lifting corner with her thumb. At the desk, she arranged pencils parallel, a way of telling a room it had been respected. The sequence ran. On final door, she slid the latch of the little upstage hallway so that the door didn't bounce. On final walk, she let the silence be the right size. When the headset voice said, "End of run," it sounded grateful, not tired. She brought the house up to half, then full. Then, after a courtesy hold that felt exactly right, let it settle back to dark. She did not move until the console returned to its home screen. On the call board, she pinned a small note in her own hand. "Thank you for your cues." Under it, she tucked a spare bulb. Months later, the show that had used the city street set closed after a warm run. An usher found under seat E13 a program folded in half with no creases where hands usually press. Inside, a penciled sentence in a tidy hand. "Please leave the ghost light center." The deckhands already did. They had found that when the lamp sat too far upstage, the lamppost misbehaved for reasons they couldn't justify on paper. When it sat dead center, the board woke without waking, and everything that needed to wait knew how. The neighborhood kept closing early. The streetlights kept their halos. The stage kept its rules. New stage managers learned the sequence without knowing they had learned it. They called holds they could not explain and discovered they were correct. Now and then, at the end of a performance, the house would settle into a quiet that curled at the edges with recognition, as if it had been practicing how to say goodnight even when no one asked. And in a room sized exactly to applause, a single clap would sometimes sound, not to demand an answer, only to mark a proper end. Story number 5. By the harbor where gulls slept on pilings like folded paper, the Peninsula Aquarium kept its water moving through the night. Pumps hummed steady as breathing, filters exhaled, and pipes answered each other in low notes that made the building feel like a sleeping animal. A night aquarist named Tessa took the graveyard rounds for a month while staff rotated vacations. Her list was simple and long: check temperatures, skim film from the touch pool, log pH and salinity, glance at every inhabitant until the quick audit of eyes told her all faces were accounted for. The public lights dropped to moon, a cool wash that made the kelp forest tank look like a theater scene. A ship's bell by the entry. A brass disc, the size of a salad plate, hung with a rope pull meant for field trips. At night, it simply absorbed light. The gift shop rolled down its grate and left a neat message in marker about new sea otter plushies. Across the hall, the moon jellies pulsed at a measured pace, self-possessed in their rhythm. On her second week, just past 1 in the morning, the hydrophone display at the bay window tank woke itself. It showed the live feed from the harbor outside, where a microphone hung beneath a dock to capture whatever the water was willing to say. A small waveform stitched across the screen. 3 tidy knocks, a pause, 3 more. The software labeled it maintenance ping, with a question mark added by someone thoughtful enough not to pretend certainty. No maintenance was scheduled. The feed monitor stamped the time as 3:07, though Tessa's watch read 1:12. She checked the camera aimed at the dock. It showed quiet pilings and a black sheen of water holding its breath. She wrote it in the log. 3 knocks, time offset, likely artifact. She finished her loop and came back an hour later. The screen had advanced to 3:07. The same 3 knocks rolled across it, identical, as if time had walked to meet the recording instead of the other way around. Nights at an aquarium are not silent. A wave machine makes a polite crash on a timer. Air stones whisper at corners where fish like to nap behind rocks. The octopus kept in a shadowed den with puzzles and toys, sometimes rearranged her enrichment items with the concentration of a watchmaker. Tessa was used to small intelligences moving around her with purpose. When something shifted, it usually declared itself as plumbing or animal behavior. The hydrophone's prediction felt like neither, and it had the courtesy to be gentle. The lower hallway toward quarantine held a chalkboard for a kid activity about tides. Draw the moon, mark high and low. No one had touched it since Saturday. On Wednesday at 2 a.m., a neat diagram appeared on it in clean white lines. The moon in 3 positions, arrows indicating pull. Underneath, the words, -tide Thursday 4:43, in tidy script. Tessa brushed the letters with her fingertip. They smudged like ordinary chalk. She told herself a day tech might have added it and forgotten to erase. She left it. The next morning, the bay retreated farther than she had seen it in months, exposing pale ribs of mud and a ladder of barnacles on the pilings. The -tide was right, down to the minute. Children would have loved the crabs hurrying from small pools to smaller ones. She noted the accuracy and circled it in her mind until it felt ordinary again. Around 3 in the morning a few nights later, the ship's bell near the entrance gave a single, polite tap. Not a swing, not a ring, just the dry kiss of rope on metal. The sound was small and exact. She checked the door camera. The lobby held its night posture benches, a model of a whale's jaw, brochures arranged like patient birds. The bell rope hung still. In the hallway, a red arrow on a wayfinding sign tilted itself by a degree, pointing toward the estuary walk, which had been closed for repair. The tilt was so slight, she doubted herself. She touched the sign. It was fastened. When she stepped away, the arrow looked true again. The estuary walk door was latched with a simple padlock. Inside the closed exhibit, the air smelled like damp reeds and distant salt. The floor sloped to suggest marsh. At night, even behind glass, the grass seemed to breathe. A small note had been slid under the door, the paper stock from the office supply closet, the pen, a plain black ballpoint. "Please do not prop open," it read, in that same precise hand. She hadn't. She pocketed the note and felt the minor scold, as if from a careful aunt who had watched a child thread a needle and wanted all 10 fingers intact. Tessa's route took her past the moon jelly room last. Blue discs throbbed with the elegant laziness of things that have mastered their niche. On Thursday, their pulse shifted. It wasn't frantic. It was precise. 4 quick pulses. Pause. 4 again. She counted and watched their bells synchronize, as if the whole colony had agreed on a beat, transmitted through some instrument she did not own. The repetition matched the minus tide chalked diagram. She smiled at the idea that jellies had read a chalkboard. Her tasks remained practical. Replace filter socks, straighten signage, skim leaf bits from a small artificial stream where kids once floated plastic boats. Yet the building began to answer her in ways that felt like a conversation conducted through drafts and light. If she left a bucket in the middle of a walkway for later, she would find it nudged neatly to the wall, as if the building had hips and preferred clear paths. If she forgot to relatch a gate at the touch pool, the "Please close after use" sign would swing once with a mild flap, and still itself as if chewing a point. One night, on her last check of the octopus, she found the enrichment cube a plastic clear box, with screw-off lids placed precisely under the intake for the exhibit's pump. It blocked nothing. It had been set there like a doorstop that did not stop a door. A small slip of paper lay beside it. Half damp, ink bled to blue. "Valve," it said. Nothing more. She peered into the cabinet below. One of the return valves wore a fragile hairline crack she would not have noticed until morning. She shut it gently, wrote a red ink note for maintenance, and thanked the unseen caution with the relief of a person given time to fix something before it broke loudly. On the darkest nights, the bay window tank turned mirror. Instead of fish outlines and kelp fronds, the glass held the ghost of the harbor itself, a fog-soft pier, a single light over a door, the suggestion of a gull's folded silhouette. She checked for interior reflections, tested her headlamp against the glass. The image remained, not sharp, not showy, just a low-tide memory laying itself over the exhibit. The hydrophone registered distant, even ticks like a heartbeat gone slow. She leaned and listened with the attention she used for friends confiding in quiet bars. The renovation on the estuary walk wrapped early. Crews left cones, a polite caution so the world would understand the paint was new. On its first open night, with no visitors to see it, a shallow fog machine in the marsh hid a little lower in its housing, as if shy in an empty room. The chalkboard drew a new diagram. RIP current demonstration condemned. The word choice felt formal. She checked the schedule and saw that the demonstration had in fact been removed. She erased the board, then rewrote, "Welcome back," in large, cheerful letters, a kindness to morning docents who would adopt whatever tone the room greeted them with. When storm fronts pushed through, the aquarium inhaled. Doors the weight of refrigerators took on persuasion before their latches gave. The wave machine in the surge tunnel made a deeper note. On one such night, the emergency lights along the floor blinked an unfamiliar sequence, 3, 2, 3, then steadied. The building's instant UPS had caught a brief sag in power. Tessa stood in the green glow and waited, to be told she had imagined it. The hydrophone wrote a string of soft knocks on its screen. And this time she answered. She took the ship's bell rope in 2 fingers and tapped the bell just enough to give it a voice the size of its shadow. The sound left the lobby and died in the hall. A moment later, from the bay window feed, 3 answering taps arrived from the harbor in perfect patience. Shortly before her month ended, a king tide appeared on the chart. a high and a low. The chalkboard had already written its numbers in a tidy hand. The night wore a warm wind that tried every seam in the building politely. At 2:38, a breaker feeding quarantine. 3 tripped without drama. A small turtle recovering from a boat strike lay under its heat lamp, dry as planned, but the tank's circulation slowed to a stubborn crawl. The emergency pump didn't kick in. Its plug showed a scorch where someone had seeded it sloppily months ago. The jellies pulsed 4 and 4. The emergency floor lights blinked 3, 2, 3. The hydrophone wrote nothing. It held a flat line that looked like concentration. Tessa went to the panel, flipped the right breaker, heard the pump cough alive. In quarantine 3, a glow traced itself along the seam of the tank like a tide line. Likely an artifact from the low-voltage emergency. But the timing felt like a nod. The turtle's eye opened to a calm sliver. She checked parameters, wrote the time, and tapped the ship's bell once on her way back, a thank you folded into metal. On her last overnight, she brought in a small, smooth stone from the shoreline, the size of a coin and the shape of a tear, white with a single gray vein. She set it on the frame of the bay window tank, not inside. Never that, just a token. She left a note for day staff about the hydrophone and the chalkboard, not to convince, just to say, the building is paying attention, it has been helpful. She placed the note under a paperweight shaped like a crab and labeled it for whoever read notes first. At dawn, the building leaned toward day. The moon mode released the slightest blue. She stood in the lobby alone for a minute and listened to everything make room for morning noise. School buses that would arrive, doors that would open, laughter that would regard every sign as permission. The bell did not ring. The door did not move. The hydrophone returned to a simple spline of harbor hush. Weeks later, she paid for a ticket and walked the exhibits on a Sunday. Families pointed and named things to each other. The chalkboard held an uncomplicated moon drawn in bright colors. In the gift shop, a child rang the ship's bell with permission and care. When Tessa reached the bay window tank, the harbor outside showed itself accurately, gray and ordinary, and a little beautiful. On the glass frame, near the corner where the stone had sat, a ring of faint salt marked its old resting place. No moisture, just the ghost of where an object had been. Nearby, the jellies pulsed 4 and 4, then settled back into their unhurried beat. She stood a minute longer than people usually do and listened to pumps talk the way polite neighbors do after sundown. Somewhere in the rafters, electricity thought about rain. Out on the water, a piling tapped against its tie with the exact ring of a small bell, once and then once again, like a building clearing its throat before deciding to let a good quiet continue. Story number 6. On a narrow street where shop windows wore their names in gold leaf, a clockmaker's sign swung on quiet hinges. The window read perennial time, letters gilded carefully enough that even dust behaved around them. Inside, shelves held clocks in every temperament. Carriage clocks with polished handles, tall case clocks standing like courteous relatives, a regulator with a silver dial and hands that knew how to be precise without showing off. At night, a single lamp by the workbench stayed on, its circle of light the color of warm parchment. The shop made a sound like rain slowed to a conversation. 100 ticks, all true, none exactly together. Quinn took the night shift during inventory because someone needed to count springs and bushings and tidy the drawers labeled with words that felt like spells escapement: verge, fuse. The day watchmaker had a neat hand and a habit of leaving notes with small arrows. Please return buffing compound here. Please don't set coffee near the lacquer. The shop smelled of old wood and lemon oil, and somewhere below that, the metallic whisper time leaves on parts it has touched for a century. On the third night, a clock started that had no right to. The French mantle with the slate case, no mainspring wound, let its pendulum go once, then twice, then found a steady, shy motion, as if it had borrowed wind from a room that wanted it moving. Quinn stood very still, hand above the bench cloth. Around the room, other ticks listened. They did not try to match it. They adjusted a hair, like listeners leaning toward a good story. A small carriage clock on the window shelf chimed one delicate note. It did not strike an hour. It simply announced, in metal, a decision. At the same moment, the regulator's seconds hand hesitated, an almost imperceptible catch at the top of its circle, and then resumed as if it had agreed to let something pass first. Quinn looked at the regulator's weight. It hung where she had left it, a tidy rectangle of brass. The hairline of dust on its edge had not moved. She wrote the time in the margin of the ledger, 11:12. Under it she added, "Without irony, courtesy hold at top of minute." The city had its own clock in the square, the kind that rang like a well-trained choir. It had not rung differently. The street outside held a dry autumn quiet. A tram bell far off made a steady, friendly ding. Inside, the mantel continued its borrowed pendulum. The little carriage clock in the window clicked once more. A bright, precise syllable. Then the room returned to ordinary, which felt suddenly like a choice. Quinn told herself she would not look for more. The fourth night created it anyway. At 11:12, the regulator's second hand paused again. A small, respectful step aside. Two clocks on the left wall advanced their minutes early, with a sound like cotton torn carefully, then waited. The barometer by the door spun a degree toward rain, and stopped at a number that had nothing to do with the weather. When she went to set the older tall case, a proud thing, with a moon dial painted with a ship she found, under its door, a slip of paper no larger than a bookmark. In careful pencil it said, "Wind the Traveler at 1:19. The Traveler was the old railroad clock that sat near the workbench, a sturdy wall model with a plain face. It had refused to hold a beat for weeks, taking a sulky pride in stopping at 20 past every time. She set a reminder on her phone because it felt wise to meet the paper halfway. At 1:19, she lifted the bezel and set the key to the arbor. The mainspring took wind smoothly. No sudden complaint. When she started the pendulum, the clock accepted the beat the way a person accepts the right-sized coat. It settled. It kept. The note's paper was an old stock rag content that didn't crumple easily with a faint watermark she couldn't place. She held it under the bench light. In the grain of it, the word return appeared and disappeared, not printed, only a ghost of the mill that had made the sheet long ago. She put the note back under the tall case door. Not out of fear, not even out of respect exactly, more to see whether the room liked things where it had found them. Night shifts draw patterns out of air. The pattern in the clock shop became a ceremony at 11:12. Then the occasional sentence in chimes. A pair of cuckoos on opposite walls gave one soft call and answered each other, then rested, as if confirming a head count. The little carriage clock shaped its single tone into a direction. If it chimed twice, the street lamp outside flickered, as if agreeing. If it chimed once, the letter slot lifted its brass flap and settled again, as if trying the weight of its own hinge. She asked the day watchmaker, a person who wore magnifiers like jewelry when not using them, whether the clocks ever liked to synchronize themselves. "They prefer not to," he said, smiling. "It's healthier if they each keep their own opinion." He showed her the regulator's old service tag, a cream rectangle that had gone the color of tea. The last signature belonged to someone long gone, in a hand that made a Q like a loop without a tail. "We keep the courtesy holds," the note field read. As if that were a familiar shop policy. A week into inventory, an older woman came in just before closing. She wore a wool coat in a shade that made you think of cherries seen at dusk, and carried a wrapped bundle the size of a book. "My father's," she said, placing a pocket watch on the felt. Its face had hairline cracks like porcelain that had been kind to time. "It stopped in our kitchen 2 weeks ago." In the middle of a sentence it had never forgotten how to say. Quinn promised to look. The woman traced the edge of the bench with one finger like a person remembering a place by touch, and left her number on a card with raised letters. That night, the clocks rehearsed what felt like welcome. The shop ticked in accord, not unison, just harmony. At 3:03, the mail slot breathed and accepted a thin parcel with the soft bluff of paper on metal. No one had knocked. The regulator gave a small, deliberate pause at 3 hours, 3 minutes, and 30 seconds. Half minute, precisely. The package lay where it landed, addressed in a careful hand. Perennial time, Atten. Last keeper. The stamp was ordinary, cancelled with lines that did not quite cross the face. Inside, under tissue paper, a tiny key rested in a cotton bed, brass gone soft with age. Its tag said, 340, 3, Hunter style. The woman's pocket watch was a hunter lid over face, hinge clean, case engraved with a modest wreath. Its serial placed it at an age when trains trusted watches like good weather. Quinn tried the tiny key. It fit the secondary arbor for the case spring, a detail some watches require, like the particular flourish to a signature. The lid lifted on a hinge that had thought itself retired. She held her breath for the short moment where time listens to see if it is wanted. The balance wheel fluttered, and then steadied. The watch took a beat. She did not call the woman at 3 a.m. She wrote 343 on the service tag and circled it, then recorded the time the room had asked for help. She set the watch on the velvet tray near the regulator where chimes didn't rattle. Around it, the shop exempted a square of silence the way a library does when someone opens a book that once made a person cry. The city's square clock stayed true. Trams maintained their courteous bell. Somewhere in the building's bones, an old schedule remembered lamplighters and night watchmen calling the hour. The shop's courtesy holds became confident, never longer than a breath, exactly where they belonged. At the top of a minute, when a second hand found 12. At 1:30, when something unseen wanted to step through. Quinn could have unplugged the bench lamp and gone home at midnight. She stayed until the sequence ended, and the room acknowledged it had ended. She met the woman the next day at noon under the sign that asked people kindly to watch their step. The watch lay in its tray, ticking a beat that insisted without bragging. The woman listened the way one listens to a friend tell a familiar story after a long time. She closed the lid and opened it twice, a small test of trust, and her shoulders released a notch. "My father used to keep it on the kitchen shelf," she said. "On Sundays he'd wind it and tell us it wasn't really for telling time. It was for remembering that we had some." She slid an envelope across the felt. Quinn slid it back once, then took it. Money is part of how things say thank you. After the woman left, a row of chiming mantel clocks along the left wall struck the hour with a slight stagger that felt like laughter. The regulator's pendulum swung past its center, with a grain of approval. The paper under the tall case, which Quinn had not moved, bore a new line of pencil: keep the left key. She checked the drawer where the shop's old keys lay in ringed families. The leftmost was small and brass, and matched the 343 tag exactly. She set it on a hook labeled with a piece of fresh tape, and felt an odd, tidy relief, the kind that comes when an object finally knows where it belongs. The last night of inventory, the pattern finished itself with the grace of a bow taken at the right time. At 11:12, the courtesy hold. At 1:19, the traveler took a breath and kept going. At 3:03, the mail slot stayed quiet, because it had nothing to do. The barometer pointed squarely at fair. The regulator did not falter. She swept, moved a stool back under the bench, lowered the shade a quarter. Before turning off the lamp, she pinned a small note to the board where the day watchmaker left arrows. "Thank you for keeping the holds," she wrote in her own careful hand. The clocks ticked on. Weeks later, walking past at dusk, Quinn paused by the window. A father and child stood looking in, their heads tilted to catch a cuckoo's polite bird. Inside, the day watchmaker set a pendulum with 2 fingers and nodded at being understood. The regulator's seconds hand reached the top and stepped aside the tiniest amount, just long enough for the child to point and say, "There." The father nodded and said, "That's right." The room accepted both answers and let time resume. On the sign, under perennial time, a second line had appeared in gold leaf so thin, it waited for the right light to confess itself. Courtesy holds kept here. Story number 7. On a ridge where the road thinned into gravel and sage, a small observatory sat like a white button sewn to the sky. The dome slit faced the valley. At night, it made a tidy wedge of darkness, as if giving the stars a polite way in. Inside, a reflector telescope on a German equatorial mount rested like a patient animal. Red lights kept their promises to pupils. Fans whispered through the electronics rack, and a dehumidifier hummed in a corner like a person thinking. Ria took a month of overnight shifts while public programs paused for maintenance. Her job was routine and content. Check the weather page, glance at the all-sky camera for creeping cloud, run flats, focus the camera until the FWHM numbers tuck themselves low, bring the dome to match the scope, and end the night with a clean shutdown. A thermos sat at the pier base, a spiral notebook kept time and notes, and a laminated list hung from the control panel because lists behave better when they don't have to pretend. The first odd thing was small and polite. At 1:44 a.m., the shutter made a soft, double knock against its stops. Not loud, not even insistent, just a measured knock-knock that sounded like metal remembering its size. There was no wind. The anemometer on the page hovered near calm. She noted it with a penciled question mark. 30 minutes later, the mount's handset beeped once and showed new coordinates in the target queue that she did not recall, adding RA, 5 hours 37 meters, deck -5 degrees 23. The object field read simply, visitor. She cleared it and slewed to her planned cluster instead. The handset did not object. When she took her exposure, the guiding plotted a straight, well-behaved line. The second odd thing offered a courtesy. Rhea had forgotten to retract the flat panel to stow height after dusk calibration. When she went out to the catwalk to align the dome, the panel had lowered itself to safe clearance by an inch, exactly enough to avoid the scope's arc. No motor whirred, no switch clicked. It was simply different in the precise way a hand leaves a door less open than it had been. She smoothed the cable coils like calming hair and said thank you to the air, not because she believed exactly, but because it helped the night locate her voice. A ring binder on the shelf by the pier held an old log. The pages were cream with years, and the tabs for months had gone the color of tea. Someone 50 years ago had written notes in a neat slant, seeing steady dome squeak at azimuth 140, pause at meridian, then flip. A few entries contained sentences that edged toward advice. Let the sky cross, then follow. One line read. Another, don't hurry the shutter, it knows its own speed. The same hand had sketched a tiny dome and added 2 dots on its curve at a place where metal meets metal 2 knocks. On the third night, the double knock at 144 returned. Rhea watched the slit from the floor, her back against the ladder, the red light washing everything into a darkroom version of itself. The knock came, gentle, present, like knuckles on wood. The webcam on the shutter track recorded no visible movement. A second later, the weather page registered a 1-degree drop on the metal sensor glued to the shutter's belly. Thermal contraction, she told herself, and wrote it down, as if naming it made it an ally. Out at the dome ring, her headlamp caught a smear of dusty fingerprints at the rail that circled the catwalk, the kind that come from gloves that have touched chalk and then touched a handrail. The maintenance crew had been there 2 days ago. Nothing mysterious about fingerprints. Yet when she put her hand down next to the smudge, her palm found the cold print of a ring, as if someone had rested their hand there with a band that had taken the night's temperature. The feeling was brief and very exact. She lifted her hand, and the cold left. Between targets, she read the old log. April, decades ago, contained a list of objects chosen for public nights, all bright, generous things. The Orion Nebula, a handful of globulars that reward patient eyes. Beside one, the old hand had written, "End with silence here." The coordinates matched the handsets unasked for visitor field. The next clear night, Rhea gave in to a compromise. She allowed the queue to include visitor, but she placed it last. She didn't tell herself why. She was saving it the way a person saves a particular cookie for the end of tea. The sky held firm. The guiding settled into a thin line. The dome followed the scope with a rubber wheel's small diligence. Once, at the meridian, the mount hesitated. A mechanical thing knows when it must flip west to east to west because the earth insists. The hesitation was not mechanical. It was a pause that felt like a bow. She waited 3 breaths, counted by the fan's rhythm, and then pressed the button. The flip went like a sentence, finishing itself after a comma instead of a period. She slewed to visitor. The scope's body turned to a piece of the sky that held no publicity in it. Not a marquee nebula, not a catalog favorite. Just a patch of modest dark with the suggestion of a stream of faint stars. She let the camera integrate for a minute, then another. The exposures populated their folder with names that made sense to computers. She blinked between them on the screen, letting her eyes do the stacking her software would later make official. A thin thread whispered across the field in each frame, slightly shifted, like a trail made by someone walking in soft dust. Not a satellite pass, those are bright, hard, gone. Not a hot pixel column, those don't move. The thread had a courtesy to it, a light touch. In the old log she found in a margin, night path noted, and a pencil arrow to coordinates that shaded into the same patch of sky. The all-sky camera fed the dome a vision of the whole night as a low-resolution meadow. A small glow arrived from the northeast, then thought better of it and faded. Passing traffic in the valley sometimes did that to the dome's eye. At 144, The double knock traveled through the shutter skin again, then settled into metal. The handset's small screen wrote, "Visitor in its own do not disturb font." Rhea pressed capture. The exposure returned with the faintest suggestion that the thread had deviated to avoid a star. It stepped aside and returned, the way two polite people negotiate a hallway. Word reached her the way practical news does. The maintenance lead left a sticky note on the monitor. "Roofers done. Please do not open in high wind. Also, the dome got sluggish and cold. Be kind to the gears." He drew a small smiley with 2 dots. Above it, someone had added a cleaner pencil line. "Pause for the metal, then continue." The pencil matched the hand in the old log, close enough that she felt the friendliness of repetition instead of the rush of alarm. On a night when a river of meteors was rumored, the ridge collected cars at dusk. Windows became viewfinders. Scarves breathed steam. Public programs were still paused, and the dome stayed locked. Rhea worked through her list, breathing with the fans. At 3:07, the all-sky camera caught 2 thin streaks that crossed and parted like threads on a loom. Quiet, accurate, kind. Inside, visitors' field deepened in tiny ways, software calls signal. The last week of her month arrived with a high-pressure cold that made the dome sound like glass when she tapped it. The double knock kept time. The handset kept offering visitor after planned work, never demanding. The old log's last page in December contained a line, "End of season. Leave the dome even." There was a simple drawing of the slit closed at center, not off to one side. She had a habit of parking it that way already. Habits that match long advice feel good in the bones. On her final night, the forecast promised a clear to the edge. She ran her flats like a cook preheating an oven. She focused on a B-star until the numbers sat neat. She finished her cue and left visitor last. At 1:44, the shutter offered its 2 soft knocks. She said, "I hear you." And the dome did not argue. The mount paused at the meridian in that respectful way. She gave it 3 breaths and then flipped. She slewed to visitor and set a longer exposure. Not reckless, just a gift. The thread wrote itself again, a faint grace line curving slightly between frames as if following contour in the dark. Halfway through the run, a woodpecker started on the far pine. 2 taps in patient sequence as if dawn had arrived early in one small point. The sound came through the metal and down through the pier and into her ribs. She laughed because it felt like a knock returning a knock. The exposure finished. When she stretched it in her software, the thread spelled nothing, drew nothing, claimed nothing. It was a path. That was enough. She shut the scope down precisely, warmed the camera body the way one does for machines that work hard, parked the mount, centered the shutter, let the dome breathe on its way closed. In the spiral notebook, under times and temperatures, she added a line she had not planned to write. "Pause for the sky when the sky asks. Don't hurry the door. Consider the path." The key lived on a ring that had 2 others, the office and the gate. She laid them on the desk in the morning and left a note about a minor stick in the dome's wheel at azimuth 220, a practical complaint. She did not write about visitor or the knocks or the thread. You can't hand those over like tools. Winter took the ridge in a polite, serious way. She returned in March, not as staff but for a public night, because old habits like to see if rooms remember them. Families climbed the steps. Children's voices echoed in small, excited notes. The guide gave a talk she had heard enough times to enjoy anew through other ears. The dome opened its wedge, careful and good. The guide slewed to the bright things for first glances. At the end, a pause came over the crowd unasked. From somewhere in the grip of metal, the faintest double knock traveled through the building. The guide cocked his head as if recalling a line and said, "We'll end on something the old logs called the visitor field. There's nothing dramatic there. It's just generous dark. Your eyes will do it." People looked. Someone whispered that they thought they saw a tiny thread imagination perhaps, or a meteor in slow motion, or the shape a patient brain gives to patience. The woodpecker found the pine again and tapped twice, respectful, still invisible. The dome's slit hung even with its frame. The cold smelled like stars. Rhea stood quietly near the pier and, in the smallest gesture she knew, nodded to the shutter as if greeting a neighbor who had once knocked to check whether anyone needed anything. Story number 8. The conservatory's east annex kept its own hours. Long after the last ensemble packed away stands and marched their cases out into the cold, a modest rectangle of light lingered in a second-floor hallway. Practice rooms lined both sides like compartments on a train. Glass panes set in each door, red, in-use lights above to tell polite lies or truths. The building's hum was a mixture of ventilation and instruments sleeping, a faint resin smell from string rooms, the breath of felt from pianos, the thin bite of brass polish that never entirely left. A night attendant named Milo took the month of graveyard shifts, while a summer program turned the main hall into a chessboard of rehearsals by day. His list: empty wastebaskets, set stools back to their marks, flip metronomes to off, check, the humidity gauges clipped to soundboards, and make sure no one had left a mute behind like a forgotten button. He liked the quiet order of it. He liked the way pencil shavings gleamed like small golden leaves in a broom's path. On the second night, Room 9's red light glowed without a door latch engaged. The panel read, "Reserved 12/6, 1:15, in thin, dry erase letters that were not his handwriting. The daily schedule downstairs held no such note. Inside, the upright piano's fallboard sat open, bench pulled to a measured distance, as if by a person who knew where their knees belonged. The metronome on top mahogany, pyramid ticked steadily at a tempo that had not been set. The weight rested at 72. It clicked 4 times and stopped, as if counting in a band that would have started anyway. On the music stand lay blank staff paper. In pencil, a tidy hand had written a pair of breath marks over an empty bar and the words, "Breathe on 3. He tapped the metronome. It did not answer. He wrote the time on the room clipboard and moved on, past brass practice cubbies where the smell of valve oil held court, past the percussion studio with its colony of mallets and jars. The corridor's big corkboard kept its usual collage: lost scarf, room etiquette, a scribble in large letters telling no one in particular to wipe rosin dust. That night, a new slip appeared among the notices, printed on standard office stock. Hall courtesy at 12/6. Please hold applause. No one programmed applause for empty rooms. He left the slip, uncertain where to file it in his head. The main hall's stage sat dark, except for a stand light left on like a lighthouse. The Steinway D wore its soft cover. Milo rolled it back, careful with the buckles. He lifted the lid to the short stick and felt the familiar weight at his shoulder. On the fallboard, someone had placed a folded handkerchief in the exact spot a page-turner sometimes rests their hands. The piano bench had been notched 1 click lower than the usual faculty setting. The soft pedal rested the smallest fraction down, as if tested. He lifted his foot and set it on the pedal. It rose with a gentle nudge that felt like it had been waiting to stand up straight. A student left their pencil in room 7, and it found its way to the top of the Steinway later that night. He recognized the instrument of mischief by its chewed ferrule. He set it beside a fresh one, sharpened, and laid a clean eraser next to both, an offering to the tribe. When he returned after a loop, marks had appeared in a copy of Debussy's Clair de Lune left open from someone's mourning. A hairpin sloped under the right hand in a manner that favored gentleness. A small bracket circled a left-hand figure and noted, "Keep the left." The handwriting was the same tidy, helpful script from room 9. It did not force. It suggested. Milo had known the building long enough to trust its quirks. Doors that resisted in humidity, a squeak in the sea stair when the heat ran. But this was not a quirk. It was a rhythm. At 12/6 each night, something mild and exact arrived. A metronome clicked its 4 and rested. A stand light brightened by one polite step. A pencil mark corrected a fingering that would keep a hand from tensing. A room's in-use light glowed for exactly an hour and 9 minutes, and then released. He set a small recorder on the hall's center aisle, not to trap a ghost, just to capture the building being itself. At 12 hours 5 minutes and 57 seconds, faint cloth against wood, the whisper of a bench finding its place. At 12 hours 6 minutes and 2 seconds, 4 ticks in perfect quarters. At 12 hours 6 minutes and 6 seconds, the sound of a page turned carefully from its upper corner, not a rustle so much as a smoothing. No melody arrived on the file. Instead, the microphones gathered the architecture, the sugar of dust moving in a light beam, the subtle hinge voice of the stage door checking its own frame. At 12:11, a foot pedal's felt met metal and withdrew like a small curtsy. The sign-out sheet on room 12, a cello room, acquired a set of pencil slashes under dates that aligned with storms. "Bring towel," the margin said, and the next day a student thanked whoever had left a towel folded over the chair like a visiting aunt's advice. In the percussion studio, a timpani head wore a small chalk ring where a hand had checked tuning just enough to save a frantic start. "Keep low," someone had written by the pedal in graceful print. A locker door that usually boomed shut decided, for a week, to settle as if resting an opinion. Down the hall, the listening library kept its reel-to-reel collection behind glass. It had been digitized years ago. The reels stayed for charm. A typed card in the catalog drawer labeled a tape as Studio Jury 1973, piano. The box was empty. A note lay in its place. On deck at midnight, fourth. The fourth arrived. At 12:06, the recorder on the hall captured a soft static like a distant radio finding a station, then the close sound of felt hammers testing an interval. Over it, a voice at the smallest volume said, "All right," the way teachers do when they prefer not to break the air. The syllables were clear, without echo. The metronome ticked its 4 and let quiet walk ahead of it. Milo began to leave small things prepared at night. He would set the Steinway bench to the lower notch. He would lay out a single-page clip where it could be reached with eyes still on the staff. He would raise the lid to short stick, set the soft pedal in neutral, and coil the lamp cord so it wouldn't snag. None of it felt ritualistic. It felt like common sense shared with a place that had decided to be considerate. One Thursday, the schedule posted a midnight juried recital in a room no one had booked. The registrar didn't own the paper. No one had typed it. It appeared like the best kind of rumor. Neat font, the conservatory logo in the corner. "No audience," it read. "Courtesy hold before exit." He told himself someone would come and cancel it by morning. No one did. At 12:06, the main hall's exit signs dimmed to their legal low. The stage light held steady. The Steinway felt, under his hand, like an animal not asleep but still. The room waited in a way that made the skin on his forearms agree to the temperature of attention. He sat in the back row. He did not cough. He did not pretend he could hear melody where there was only the architecture of playing. What came was the shape of music without its clothes, the pressure of a key returning to catch, the soft click inside the action, a pedal changing the room's matting, time grouped into phrases by breath you could not hear but knew. Now and then a pencil made a half syllable, the graphite's point tracing a loop over a note someone would later understand. He waited when the room waited. He did not clap. He didn't need to. At 1:15, the red light on room 9 went out, and the hall seemed to lean back by an inch. Small aids continued. Lower stand for shared page. A post. It said one night on a lectern in the small recital room. Check screw on the second bench leg, another said, and when he looked, the screw had backed itself 2 threads from where safety lives. A brass mute left on a windowsill found its way to the owner's case with a quick note tucked under the clasp. Next time, keep it in the pocket. The handwriting never became playful. It stayed useful. On his last week, the weather fell heavy and the building creaked with polite complaint. The humidity in room 9 dipped to 40 and held there. He brought in a small bowl of water, the old trick, and set it discreetly near the radiator. An hour later, the gauge climbed 5 points and steadied. On the staff paper, someone had written, "Thank you," a word with no punctuation, the graphite so soft it almost refused to shine. The metronome ticked its 4 at 12:06 and stopped. His shift rotated out with the month. He left a few habits behind. The bench at its lower notch, 2 sharpened pencils on the Steinway, a spare page clip in the hall's drawer. A note for day staff that said only, "Please respect 12:06 if you find yourself here." He did not try to make a rule. Later, when he returned as any member of the public to sit in a daytime student recital, the kind with families leaning forward and smartphones divided between video and restraint, he felt the room recognize him without making a scene. The performer took a breath so quiet it edited the air. At the turn of a phrase, the soft pedal engaged by a hair, and the hall's small systems, seemed to honor the gesture. Air vent lessened. A hinge chose not to test itself. A phone that would have rung decided to learn patience for once. Somewhere, in a corridor where doors knew how to be careful, a metronome clicked 4 times and rested. like a person tapping a table to remind themselves that keeping time is a form of kindness. Story number 9. The AM tower had a modest blink, red against a sky that smelled like cold dust. The station sat in a low building beside a field, a rectangle with a front office, a tiny newsroom, a production closet, and the board that kept everything alive. Overnight, the lobby fluorescence went to half, the soda machine hummed in a corner, and the old carpet by the rack room held a comforting scent of ozone and coffee. A paper sign above the control board said in a teacher's handwriting, "No dead air." Someone had underlined it twice a long time ago and drawn a small smile, because rules work better when they don't scowl. Dana took the midnight shift because she liked steady nights and the quiet authority of a red on-air light. She read the weather, the farm futures, the town birthdays, and the list of school closings when winter misbehaved. The automation computer rolled through music from shelves of digitized carts. Her hand rode the faders with a confidence earned in small rooms. Top of the hour meant the legal ID, the town name, the frequency, the call letters in a tone that felt like pointing to your own house on a map. The first oddness was punctual, in a way machines rarely are. At 1 hour, the time code on the automation screen clicked early by half a second and fired the ID, her recorded voice from yesterday sliding out with clean consonants. WCRP, 810 AM, Evergreen County. She hadn't touched the button. She glanced at the rack. The EAS unit watched with its 2 little green eyes. She reset the stack, shrugged at her own reflection in the window, and laughed softly, because nothing was wrong, only exact in a way that refused to explain itself. The second oddness arrived at 1:33. The EAS printer, an old thermal strip model that usually only offered required weekly tests and weather bulletins, woke with a tidy whir and fed a single line. It read, "Hold carrier 1 hour 33 minutes and 30 seconds for 020. She frowned. Holding carrier meant silence on purpose. Transmit nothing but the invisible backbone that carries sound. The sign above the board had underlined this as a sin. Her finger hovered. Then she let the song finish and opened the mic to say the temperature and the time, just to prove she wasn't flustered by paper. She did not hold anything. The printer went quiet. After 2 o'clock, callers found their way to the line that was more suggestion than invitation. Truckers asked for old songs that lived in muscle memory. A third-shift nurse sent a hello to a coworker, reading a magazine at the nurse's station. Dana kept the delay box, the 7-second safety net, set to a cautious middle. When she took one caller, a man who wanted a song about a train because his father had worked nights on the line, the delay box glowed its red ready and then flashed once like a blink. She heard her own voice answer the man before she spoke. Exactly, syllable for syllable. "We can do that." The box had played what was about to be. She said the line anyway and lifted her hands away from everything, like someone who has realized their plate has slid to the very edge of the table and managed to stop it. The station had a transmitter shed beyond the field, a concrete block room with a locked door and a switch marked day divided by night that no one touched without permission. The fence around the tower hummed the faintest song, a carrier's whisper leaking into metal where it shouldn't. On a break, she stepped outside and let the cold put thoughts in order. The tower blinked its obliging red. Somewhere, a late train laid a soft horn on the town that felt like bedtime for streets. When she rested a hand on the fence post nearest the shed, she felt a pulse, not pulse, a pressure so minor it could have been her own blood. She left it and returned, because the board doesn't like to be alone for long. At 2:41, the EAS printer fed a second note. Pattern equalization, 2 hours 40, 1 minutes and 20 seconds. Hold carrier 0 to 20. A small drawing in ASCII marked a rectangle with a line through its center. It looked like nothing, and exactly like the tower from a sleepy printer's point of view. She did not hold carrier at 2 hours 41 minutes and 20 seconds. She leaned toward the glass and watched the humidity bead on the reflection of the tower house door. She imagined the chief engineer a decade ago, making notes for a night operator with a pencil and a thermos. She said into the mic, "You're listening to WCRP, because naming things is sometimes the only way to own them." The newsroom still had its wire machine, more habit than necessity, an old dot matrix bridged to the web feed. Headlines unscrolled at polite intervals. On Wednesday, a bulletin arrived stamped with a time 3 minutes ahead of now. County road work. Overnight closure. New overpass at Halcyon Creek. Expect detours. She read it on the half hour because it was a service. At 3:14, a caller phoned from a stretch of 2-lane near the creek. "I'm at a light that didn't used to be here," he said, almost amused. "Y'all always this fast?" The detour map would be on the county site by morning. The overpass would be in the news next week. She put her palms flat on the plywood edge of the board to keep from planning reasons. At 4:11, with the board's lights like a small town seen from a hill, the EAS unit burped another line. "Thank you." It looked absurd on the strip. "Machines do not prepare. Please. And thank you." She tore the paper free and put it under the little baton-shaped paperweight that had lived on the desk longer than any operator. Night after night, the pattern kept its manners. The ID fired true, and sometimes a breath early. The delay box rehearsed her replies a heartbeat before she made them, as if keeping the lane clear, like a person walking one step ahead and holding a door. The printer suggested brief holds at 1 hour 33 minutes and 30 seconds and 2 hours 41 minutes and 20 seconds and, once, pause at 3:3, let test pass. The EAS never blared. It simply asked. She argued less each night. She learned the shape of those small silences and how to keep her hands still and let the carrier be enough. 20 seconds of nothing taught her that radio without sound is not empty. It is structure, the way blank measures in a score hold the room for the note to land. In the production closet, she found a tray of old carts labeled in handwriting decades out of date, the ink the color of tea. One read, "Midnight Gardeners. PSA." She'd never heard it. She spooled the audio into the system. The spot was simple and kind. A volunteer group asking night workers if they'd like to see the city's pocket parks in dawn light when their shift ended. "Bring gloves," the voice said, practical. "We have coffee." At 1:33, the printer said, "Run Midnight Gardeners after hold." She obeyed. The spot's piano bed sounded like a kitchen. Static on the monitor speakers softened for its 30 seconds, as if the station had leaned in to listen. The chief engineer came in one afternoon to replace a temperamental relay. He stared at the thermal paper, taped neatly by the console. "Nobody writes this stuff anymore," he said, not scolding, not dismissive. He traced the ASCII tower with a thumb. "Once upon a time, you had to baby the pattern at night. The ground gets real friendly with the signal after midnight. Sky's a mirror. You can step on your own toes." He tapped the EAS. "These boxes don't say please." He replaced the relay, left a sticky note that he'd done it, initialed in block letters the color of sky. A week later, a letter arrived in the station mailbox. Paper, stamped, addressed in a modest hand to Knights at WCRP. Inside, a folded lined sheet, pencil writing like a careful ledger. "If you're the person holding carrier at 1:33, thank you. We've been catching a hum off your sideband into the greenhouse timers across the river. The hold lets the mischief pass. We heard the gardener spot. We'll bring gloves. No name." A corner of the paper had a small ring where a coffee cup had set for a heartbeat and then been moved. The final night of her month came with a clear sky and a fog at ground level that made the tower blink into an island. She set the board carefully, checked the playlist twice, left a note for the morning host about a caller who had lost a scarf, and found it again at the grocery store because the cashier remembered. At 1 hour 33 minutes and 30 seconds, she held carrier, watching the VU meters rest with a patience she now trusted. The air in the room felt like the moment before rain, structured, not ominous. At 1 hour 33 minutes and 50 seconds, she brought up the gardener's PSA, then the next song in key, like a handoff done in a practiced hallway. At 2 hours 41 minutes and 20 seconds, she held again. 20 seconds exactly, the way one waits for a crosswalk to favor the other direction. The EAS printed a line at 02:42. Path clear. At 4, the strip fed again. "End with quiet," it said. The legal ID needed its syllables. She spoke them in a soft voice, gave the temperature one last time, let the bed music fall under the floor like a rug smoothed by a practiced hand. Then she didn't speak. The carrier did its invisible job. The tower blinked. Somewhere across the river, timers in a greenhouse decided on a proper minute to click. In a parked truck on the county line, A driver understood a small hush on the air as a gift and breathed differently without knowing why. Morning hosts like to pretend nights have no secrets. They found Dana's notes modest and her board clean. She took a day shift somewhere else by fall. The tower blinked, for whoever needed blinking. Once, driving through the county on an errand at midnight months later, she turned the dial out of habit and landed on 810. An unfamiliar voice kept the bed low and the company high. At 1:33, the music faded to carrier. 20 seconds. The night did what nights do. When the voice returned, it felt, to her, like a door reopened. She smiled at the empty highway and lifted her hand from the wheel for the smallest wave toward a field with a fence that hummed the faintest hum. The printer, back in the little room, likely fed one clean, inhuman word at 4:11, and then went still, until asked again to be kind. And now, the last story has faded. The whispers grow still, the roads fall quiet, and the shadows step back into their waiting places. What remains are only echoes, soft, steady, and lingering long after the night has passed. Let the silence surround you now. Close your eyes, breathe slow, and allow sleep to carry you gently into its hold. Good night.